Hello, and thanks for joining me today for episode 827 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today I am thrilled to be resharing our interview with our guest, Dr. Chris Buddle. Listeners, Chris is a community ecologist who studies biodiversity of different species, and he's interested in figuring out what animals are where in our ecosystem. In particular, his work focuses on spiders, insects, and other arthropods. And in this episode, Chris shared some fantastic stories from his life and science. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. I am thrilled to be here today with Dr. Chris Buddle. So, Chris, welcome to our show. How are you today?
I'm doing just great. It's a beautiful spring day, and I'm really excited to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Well, we are delighted to have you with us, and we are excited to hear about your life in science. But first, I want to introduce you to our listeners. So listeners, a little bit about Chris. He is an associate professor in the Department of Natural Resource Sciences, as well as associate dean of student affairs at McGill University. He received his undergraduate training in ecology at the University of Guelph and was awarded his PhD in ecology and environmental science from the University of Alberta. Afterward, Chris conducted postdoctoral research at Miami University before accepting a position at McGill, where he is today. And now Chris has received a number of awards for his exceptional teaching and research, including the Entomological Society of Canada's C. Gordon Hewitt Award for Excellence in Entomology in Canada, also the MacDonald Campus Award for Teaching Excellence, as well as the Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education's Desire to Learn Teaching Innovation Award. And Chris also writes fantastic articles in his Arthropod Ecology Blog. And listeners, Chris is here with us today to talk about his experiences in life and science. So Chris, today we have a lot of questions to ask you. We want to know about you both as a person, but also as a scientist. So can you start with the life outside of science and tell us how you spend your time?
I must admit, I have a lot of different hobbies, and I think I drive my family a little crazy with my different obsessions. And currently, it's all about birds. And I know a lot of people that do research and also like birds, and it's a really good fit because birds are diverse and beautiful and in our natural environment. So even this morning, I took my youngest son out to a bird banding station for a couple hours just to see the spring migrants coming through. It's just an exceptional experience. So I like birds. I also like to draw birds. I like to doodle, and I always carry a sketchbook. By no means would I say I'm a good artist, but I find that's a wonderful creative outlet. And I like to draw, and I like to draw birds. So the two hobbies go hand in hand for sure.
Oh, that is fantastic.
It's also a great way to kind of learn more by trying to draw things so you get a different perspective on what species look like and what they do in their ecosystem. So that's a lot of fun. But those are both kind of geeky science habits in some way. I do a lot of bike riding, and I'm a busy family guy. I've got 3 kids. 2 of them are teenagers. I got a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 16-year-old. So we have a busy family life, which means there's a reasonable amount of my time that's spent chauffeuring teenagers around, which gives me a chance to listen to the radio a lot.
Fantastic. Well, wonderful to get a window into your life outside of science. Now, you mentioned you like to draw birds, and I know you study spiders. Do you draw spiders as well?
I do, but it's funny because I get a lot more satisfaction out of drawing birds. And I think sometimes when you're so close to a subject, like as an arachnologist, I spend so much time and energy thinking about spiders and thinking about arachnids that when I sit down with a sketchbook, I actually don't want to spend any more time thinking about them. And I actually want to think about other things and draw other things. So it's interesting. I do sometimes draw arachnids and insects and other things, but the birds I'm always drawn to. And it's been actually a lot of years now that I'm drawn to birds for some reason and draw birds.
Yeah, I like it. Well, birds are sort of your escape then.
I think so, yeah.
So now we've hinted a little bit about what you do in the scientific world. You study spiders. Can you give us the high-level view of how you describe your work to someone who's not familiar with your field?
When I think about my research over the last sort of 20 years, I've always been interested in trying to figure out what animals are where in our ecosystems. And by animals, my focus has largely been on spiders, but I also work a lot on insects and other arthropods. So those are all the critters that are bugs with hard exoskeletons and lots of legs is how I like to describe them. So I'm really, I guess, a community ecologist. I like ecology, and I like to think about biodiversity and the variety and diversity of different species in the world with a focus on insects and spiders. And the other day I was kind of looking back on my different publications and on my career, and that's the one common theme is documenting patterns of biodiversity in different parts of the world. So that's probably in a nutshell how I would describe my research interests as an ecologist and as a arachnologist / entomologist.
Very cool. Well, wonderful to hear a little bit more about your work. And I'm excited to talk about some of the projects you have going on in the lab as we go through the interview. But you mentioned a lot of things in the beginning. You mentioned balancing your family life, all these hobbies you have going on, as well as your science. And I know the balancing act can be a challenge sometimes. So I am always on the lookout for motivation and inspiration myself. So do you have a favorite quote or maybe a saying that inspires you?
There are a couple, actually. One of the ones that I take as almost a daily reminder is I think it's Annie Dillard who said something like, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. And that is really insightful because we have to enjoy and cherish every day, because at the end of the day and the end of the weeks and the end of the month and the end of the year, it's really made up of all these moments that themselves we shouldn't just pass by quickly. We should try to enjoy those moments. So I think that's one quote that is being quite inspirational and something to keep in mind. And I guess on a more sciencey front, I think it's Churchill's quote on about how success is basically going from failure to failure without a loss of enthusiasm. I think I probably messed it up a little bit, but on the outside looking in, sometimes it looks like science is just always success after success. People publish their papers and they, there's grad students and they do great work all around the world. But in fact, it's really made up of failure after failure. We keep plugging along. And if you can keep up the enthusiasm, even despite some of the challenges, I think that's a really insightful quote to think about as a scientist.
Definitely. Well, Chris, I love both of these quotes. And I think the sense of humor kind of goes along with the latter one as well. Not just enthusiasm. You sort of have to laugh to yourself sometimes after all these failures.
Yeah, you really do. It's like, what, am I hitting my brick wall again and again? But over time, as you pick away at a difficult question or a difficult topic, you do make progress, even if it can be frustrating along the way.
Definitely. And now through some of these challenging times, through some of these frustrating times, it's helpful to have these little motivational quotes and sayings, but it's really helpful to have people who are supporting you along your journey or people who you're looking up to. So Chris, can you tell us about some of the people who may have inspired or motivated you along your own journey?
Science is such a collaborative effort, and there's such a large number of people that influence. In some cases, it's subtle daily interactions, and those people end up really influencing your thought and your habits and how you proceed through your academic career. I think for sure one person who influenced me a lot is my postdoc supervisor. Her name is Ann Ripstra. She's at Miami of Ohio. And she was just so inspiring in her approach to science in a very, I would say, careful and thoughtful and critical in all the right kind of ways approach to a research question and approach to thinking about science. And in an almost gentle but very critical approach to thinking through a scientific research question in a paper, very analytical and very critical, but in a very gentle, positive way. And it was a really lovely time that I spent in Ohio. And as I look back on it, she really influenced. I'm not really that way. I'm a bit more of a bull in a china shop approach to science. So having a slightly different perspective in approaching scientific problems is really, really useful. And I think sort of through my career at McGill, there's been a lot of my colleagues in my department who, there's a wildlife biologist named Murray Humphrey who I've always looked up to. He and I started around the same time, and he's always been a good colleague. And the chair of my department now, Professor Jim Files, was very instrumental early in my career and a bit of a mentor. So there are definitely a lot of people. It's hard to pinpoint one or two because it's really a big team. And even on a daily basis, you got to look to your own community outside of an academic life as being inspiration, because the inspiration and the drive to do science, but also find a balance between work and between life, requires having people outside of your academic world that are inspirational. And certainly my family plays a big role there.
Certainly. Well, I love this idea of drawing inspiration from a lot of different sources around you as you go through your journey. And I think this approach is really helpful. A lot of scientists have so many mentors as they go through their careers. And I really like this idea you brought up of gentle criticism. I think this is a fine line in science, right? Because we're trained to tear everything apart, but you have to sort of deliver it gently sometimes.
Yeah, I think so. And I think science can be tough and unfriendly at times, and it doesn't need to be. And that's one thing I've always liked about the field of entomology and arachnology is the community of people involved in that field is just a really nice community. And in the sense that I think it's because there's so much to discover that no one really paints lines or feels that they're super protective of one area, because there's this general acceptance, I think, that we have so far to go that let's all work together as much as we can and let's share as much as we can. So I think actually that's one reason I was drawn to that field, as well as my sort of fascination with natural history and biodiversity of small things. But yeah, I think that approach of collaborative learning from a more positive standpoint is really the way to go with science.
Definitely. And speaking about what drew you to this field, I'm curious to hear about what drew you to science initially. Chris, can you take us back to your very beginning, your first memories of maybe being interested in science, and tell us what sparked that love for you?
I have the benefit of growing up in a part of the world near Peterborough, Ontario in Canada. And I grew up in a town just south of where the Canadian Shields starts. So around where I grew up was kind of limestone, sort of shrubby forest. And then as you drove north or headed north, the granite outcrops would strike up from the ground and you get these giant white pine trees and lots of lakes and lots of opportunities for sitting in canoes and going fishing. And so my family always was an outdoorsy kind of family. And my dad was a high school biology teacher. So you're all going to say, yeah, no surprise that he went into biology, right? So we always had field guides with us on these canoe trips. And I remember my parents spending a lot of time thinking about, oh, look at these neat moss and let's go picking cranberries. And that's an osprey that's diving down for fish. And so I think it started back then just by real exposure to being outdoors. And then as I started my academic career after high school, I went into engineering and absolutely hated it. So I took off and traveled for a year, went to New Zealand and thought I would never come back to school. But I did, and I came back to ecology and loved it. And then sort of towards the end of my undergraduate, I got an opportunity to be a research assistant on a project that was looking at ancient cedar trees growing off cliff faces just outside of Toronto. And that project, as I was hanging off ropes staring at cliff faces, I could see a lot of spiders. There were spiders everywhere. I thought, you know what? I think it'd be fun to do a little project on spiders. And I was so naive. I thought it'd be such a simple thing to do.
Yeah. I like that attitude too, being excited about the spiders. I would have been terrified. But
people have their different approaches to spiders for sure. But that's how I got into spiders. It just out of sort of curiosity. And I literally sort of bumped into them as I was hanging off these cliff faces. And then I went on to do PhD work, and I literally did an internet search to find someone in Canada. I knew I wanted to stay in Canada for my PhD. My wife and I were just getting married at the time, and we thought, well, yeah, let's stay in Canada and see what we can find. And I was drawn to a lab out in Alberta by the supervisor, John Spence, who's quite a well-known figure in ecology and entomology. And I went to his lab and just kept going with studying spiders and just kept going from there. So when I really got that opportunity as an undergraduate to work in a lab, that really sparked the research interest, and that kind of led on to a career in entomology and arachnology.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned there was this time where you maybe got frustrated with engineering, decided to leave, took off for New Zealand of all places, and then you thought you weren't going to come back. What brought you back?
I didn't have any money. So it was kind of practical in some ways. I was in New Zealand. I'd run out of money, and I was like, it was like in February, I think. And I'm like, what am I going to do? I think I got to go home. I had a plane ticket back. So I came back, and I actually met up with my now wife, and she and I got back together that winter after I got back from New Zealand. And she was going to University of Guelph as well. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go back to school now. This is a good idea. And then I literally picked up a course calendar for Guelph and flipped through it. This is so not how to do things, right? I flipped through the calendar and saw the word ecology and kind of looked down the courses and thought, that sounds interesting. It's so random how these things happen.
Yeah.
So I went back to school and I took a gap year, but came back with sort of a new kind of enthusiasm.
Now, why did you select New Zealand?
Ever since I was a kid, I dreamed of going to New Zealand, and I don't really know why. I think it was National Geographic magazines that were lying around the house, so they'd flip through them, and I always thought New Zealand was interesting. I think the kiwi birds always fascinated me, and kind of this idea of having the glaciers and mountains right next to ocean and fjords and forests, and so I was really drawn to it for some reason. I had a great trip. It was a wonderful experience.
That's funny. I had to ask because I know as a kid I was obsessed with Australia. It was like the koalas, the desert, the outback, like all that. So,
and I think it's so far away. Like I couldn't have gone further away from Canada to New Zealand. It's pretty far, but still kind of a country that would have been familiar. I was quite young, of course, at the time. So somewhere that was familiar to me, and I knew that would be interesting and safe and all those qualities.
Sure. Don't have the language barrier. I think that helps a lot as well.
Yeah, that's right.
So now talk to us a little bit more about what's going on in your research today. Is there a particular project that you have in the lab that you are just so excited to be working on?
There's a couple things. So in the last 10 years or so, I've been doing a lot more work in the Arctic, and I've always sort of been drawn to thinking about doing some work in the Arctic. So we had some grants to do some big projects up north, and that was really exciting. And so it's been a lot of years now that I've been sending students up north to keep plugging away at certain questions up there. And this summer, actually, my PhD student, Sean, the project I'm really excited about is his work on food webs of the tundra. And what he's trying to do, what we've been very curious for a long time, is how food webs in the north are constructed. And by food webs, I'm really focusing more on the arthropod-based food webs. So the spiders and insects and other critters that live in the tundra, how do they interact and how's that food web built? And that has all kinds of implications for the wildlife that's up there and for the processes that happen within the Arctic tundra. And especially as we think about climate change and environmental change in the north, we really have to understand what the species are doing in their food webs. So Sean is going up north. He's going to be in the Yukon and working at a place called Tombstone Territorial Park. And he'll be kind of unpacking the food web and actually doing manipulations where he adds different species of spiders to look at how they're affecting the rest of the food web in the Arctic system. So that project's been a long time coming, and now I've got a student that's super excited to do it. So that's probably the project I'm most excited about right now. And then I've got some really neat work happening in some forests more locally, and that's patterns of biodiversity in tree canopies compared to the understory in a forest between Montreal and Ottawa.
Interesting. Well, I'm fascinated by this work in the Arctic. And I know many of us don't think of the Arctic as a place that's lush with spiders and insects and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit about the spiders there and why are they so special?
That's a great question. One of the most common questions I get when I say I work in the Arctic with spiders, people say, what? There's spiders in the Arctic?
Terrible.
Yeah. And it is a good question because the season's so short. And of course, you've got permafrost as well. And you've got this sort of harsh environment and no trees and reduced vegetation diversity. But there are a lot of spiders up there. In fact, I think our work over the last few years has documented well over 300 species that live quite far north. Even way, way up on the top of Ellesmere Island, there's still, I think, 9 or 10 species that live up there. And they're really, I would say, among the most common arthropods in the Arctic. Spiders and flies, I think, dominate Arctic systems. And the spiders, we've even documented their density. And we know that some groups of spiders, like wolf spiders, for example, there's pretty close to 1 wolf spider per square meter on the tundra. And when we add up the other spiders that are also in those systems, it's well over 5, it might even be higher than that, spiders per square meter. So the actual sheer number of spiders in the Arctic is mind-blowing in terms of the density as well as the diversity. So there are a lot of spiders in the Arctic.
That is fascinating. So now your work obviously involves some level of field work. Can you tell us a little bit about the balance? How often are you in the field versus in the lab?
Well, with entomology and arachnology research, I would say the ratio is probably like 1 to 20 in terms of how much time we spend in the field relative to the lab, or even more than that. It's probably like 1 to 50.
Gotcha.
Most of the work is not glamorous. Most of the work is time at a microscope and at a computer. But the fieldwork component is certainly really fun. And my role now as a supervisor is more troubleshooting and more just making sure that the students have the projects designed appropriately. And I also take pictures, and so there are pictures available for PowerPoint presentations, et cetera. So the supervisor becomes the trip photographer, the troubleshooting, and the person that gets in the way in many cases, because the students really, they're the ones that spend more time than I do in the field.
Sure, they've got their projects.
Yeah, they got their projects, and I'm there to pay the bills and make sure things go okay and put my name on the permits, etc. But I try to spend time with all my students in the field as much as possible. I'm usually up north a couple of weeks each summer where the students will spend a month or 6 weeks up there. But it's really tough to be away for long periods of time because of my other commitments back home. So I'm pretty careful about how much time I spend away.
Certainly. So I'm just picturing the logistics here, and I've not done much field work myself. So how do you study, or how do you even find these brown spiders on the somewhat brownish tundra out there?
You develop a search image like anything else. And I think once you get a sense of what to look for and the size and shape of them, they're pretty easy to find. And if you sit down on the tundra, within a minute, you'll have spiders wandering around if you look for them. So it's developing the search image and expertise and practice and time for sure. But the logistics of Arctic fieldwork are definitely challenging. And one of the reasons we work in the Yukon quite a bit is because you can fly into Whitehorse, which is a big center, and rent a car and be able to drive up to the Arctic tundra from there. So there's a road called the Dempster Highway, which goes even past the Arctic Circle. It's accessible, but working in the Arctic islands is quite a bit more challenging and quite a bit more expensive. So the logistics are really challenging. Anyone that wants to get into Arctic fieldwork needs to, I think, recognize that there's a significant amount of time spent on logistics.
Definitely. And speaking of these challenges, I know there are challenges in every field, and I love talking to scientists about some of these challenges they faced, failures they've had, or struggles that they're going through, just to give people a realistic view of what life is really like as a scientist. It's not always a glorious adventure, although it is much of the time. So can you share a story of your own?
I sort of foreshadow to some of the challenges of Arctic work are things like logistics. And we'd have had situations where you spend a lot of money and time and energy to get people up north, and then the weather's really bad for like 2 weeks, and you need good weather. So
right.
You're stuck for days without being able to do very much. That's really, really tough, and tough on everybody because the students have a lot at stake. And as a supervisor, you know that it costs to be up there. So there are logistical challenges, and even things like moving. We use ethanol for preserving specimens and shipping ethanol. You have to have special permits and people with the right expertise to be able to ship certain materials to remote places. So there's definitely logistical challenges. I think the story I'd like to share, though, is quite a bit different, actually. If we travel to Africa for a minute, and
I like it.
From the Arctic to Africa, as a scientist, we get involved in all kinds of different things. And a couple of years ago, I got invited to participate in a research project that was developing a proposal around pest management in parts of East Africa for some different crops. And I was invited to be involved because one of the aspects of the project was looking at the effect of different types of pest management on biodiversity, so of things like insects and spiders. So I was invited to be a lead on this grant proposal. And this was a major, major grant proposal that took months and months of work and took a trip, which is lovely, of course. We did a trip to East Africa to work with the scientists over there. It was a major grant proposal that took a pretty incredible amount of energy and time. And with these things, you end up dreaming of these things at night. When you're sitting at the dinner table, your mind will wander towards the proposal. And as the due date approaches, it gets more stressful. And everyone knows this story as a scientist, how much you invest in it. And this one here, we ended up being extremely close to getting the grant. We made it past the first cut, and we knew that we were being seriously considered. And it was a very big grant, and it would have been quite a change in terms of my research direction and everything else. And we didn't get it. And we have to deal with failure all the time. But it's hard when you invest that much energy into something, and then you're kind of deflated afterwards. And there's a period of time where the energy's gone, and it's hard to get jazzed up again about another project, knowing how much work went into something. And if I look over the last couple of years, that's been, I think, one of the biggest challenges that I've faced in recent years. And I'm fine with it now, but for a few months afterwards, it was really tough. You don't really realize how much you invest in something until it doesn't work out, and you're like, oh, I can't believe it, all that work and nothing to show for it, which is not true, because there are things to show for it. You've learned a lot, you met other scientists, you develop neat project ideas, and you have a grant proposal that you can use to shop around to other places, but it's still tough.
Definitely. And I know I'm the same way when I'm putting a grant in. I try ahead of time not to get my hopes up just in case, but it's hard not to, because you're absolutely right. You're investing so much in it. You're excited about the research questions. You really want to see this project go to fruition. And then just to get that rejection is really harsh sometimes. So you mentioned there was a period of maybe a couple of months where you were struggling to get that motivation back. What helped you through this difficult time and got you back on track?
I think just time. I'll go back to the Churchill quote. It's failure after failure. I mean, I don't know how many papers get rejected before they get accepted. We have to develop broad shoulders in science. And I think not being able to handle failure or rejection is really going to make your life tough as a scientist. And sometimes you just have to kind of just keep going. And I think for me, after that grant proposal didn't work out, I just got into other things and started other projects. And over time, it was fine. And of course, you also think that in hindsight, well, I mean, it's a good thing that I didn't get that grant because it would have meant this, that, or the other. You started just
justifying it.
Yeah. Which is fine. So I think the big one is time. And then you do, as a scientist over time, you develop more resiliency and you develop more and more abilities to accept failures. As I think the ratio of failures to successes is certainly skewed towards failure in science. And we know this. We know this from job applications. I kept all my rejection letters when I was looking for a tenure track position. I kept them in an envelope because it was really important and is important for me to remember that it is a long road, and we like to celebrate successes, but it can be a long road.
Certainly. And I think talking about these failures is really important, but we don't want to dwell on them. So I want to give you an opportunity, Chris, to tell us about one of these success stories. And I love it celebrating all of the successes in science. So this can be a big win or even just a little victory along the way that meant a lot to you.
I've had some wonderful, wonderful successes with teaching awards and with opportunities to travel to different places and to celebrate research excellence. But I would say most recently, I had 2 PhD students that graduated last year. And there's something, as a supervisor, something really special about seeing your students nail a PhD defense and get their papers published and move on to other opportunities. And to me, that's a really great success, and that's something that I feel very proud of and very proud of them. And that's, to me, a most recent big success, is seeing students move through successfully.
Definitely. Well, congratulations on these students happily finishing their PhDs, I'm sure. And I'm curious, now you mentioned these awards you've had for teaching. I mentioned them also in the introduction. And I know one of them was specifically for teaching innovation. So it kind of sparked my curiosity. What sort of innovating teaching methods do you use? Or are there ones that you found that work really well?
The award that I got, the Innovation Award I got, was specifically for a project and approach to teaching a field biology class where we used mobile technology. We used tablets out in the field as an additional tool for teaching and learning. And we also use social media tools together with the mobile technology. And it became a field course that actually extended around the world through social media tools and blogs and through the mobile technology. So originally it was just a project to look at how we might integrate mobile technology into field biology. And then it became over several years much bigger than that, where we actually looked at how things like Twitter affect learning dynamics in a teaching environment and how mobile technology can further facilitate learning dynamics outside of a classroom, even in a field class, which sounds a little counterintuitive because you think, why would you take technology to the field? But there's all kinds of uses for technology in the field. So that's really where some of the teaching award bits came from, was that idea of social media and mobile technology.
Very cool. Now, you mentioned Twitter. I know you're on social media as well. Is this something that you find helps you as a scientist and helps you with maybe connecting people in your career?
Absolutely. I mean, science communication is a key skill that we need to develop as scientists, and we need to use all the different avenues for that. We write scientific papers that a lot of people don't read, but we should also be writing plain language summaries of our work, and we should be working with our media relations office to communicate about our research. We should be speaking to elementary schools, talking to the local gardening club about insects, and we should be using Twitter and Facebook and Instagram to share the human side of science, but also the results of science. People are insanely curious out there, and I think we have a responsibility as scientists to jump out of a comfort zone and jump out of the ivory tower and get into communities, whether it's through Twitter or whether it's through a talk in an elementary school.
Definitely. And I think blogs are also a great platform for this. And I know you run a blog yourself. Can you tell us what got you interested in starting one in the first place?
Well, the same thing. It's just I've always had a passion for outreach and education. And I think the field of entomology and arachnology lends itself so well, because you say the word spider or insect and you get a reaction. So It's a great way to break down some barriers, I think. The blog started just as a news from the lab blog and then evolved into something much more where it's more commentary on higher education or research results or things about spiders or news from the lab. All these sorts of things get tied into the blog, and it's been a lot of fun working on it. And it comes and goes. Some months I post regularly, and over the last few weeks, for example, I haven't posted anything, but it's really been enjoyable.
Definitely. So we've talked a little bit about your life outside of science as well in the beginning of our interview. And I know for me, it's always hard to find time to read when I'm not in the lab, kind of escape from the literature a little bit, find something fun to read. I'm always looking for recommendations though. So Chris, is there a book that you've read that you have really enjoyed? And this can be a science book or a non-science book, something completely different our listeners should read as well.
I do a fair bit of reading. It's just I absolutely love reading, and it's how I fall asleep every night, which is the big part of my life for sure. Science books, I got all kinds of science books I love. In fact, The Forest Unseen was one that I read last year by David George Haskell, which is about a naturalist going back to the same patch of forest for a year and watching it grow and change over the year. It's a really beautiful book. But in terms of fiction and non-science books, I always give the same response to this question, and that is John Steinbeck's East of Eden, which is an older book, but still one of the most beautifully written books out there. And I haven't read very many books more than once, but I think I've read that one 6 or 7 times. I keep going back.
Oh, wow.
I just love it. I love it so much.
Well, I have never read it. I'm going to have to add it to my list.
Yeah, it's really exceptional. And the other one I just read just the other day, rereading some Cormac McCarthy, who has a dark side to his writing, but also a very beautiful American writer that I really appreciate. So anything by Cormac McCarthy, and certainly John Steinbeck. And more recently, I just read The Sisters Brothers, which has just been on everyone's list recently, which is a really interesting book if you like that genre of Western oddball kind of books.
Awesome. Well, I am going to put these out on our website for our listeners to find there, and I'm going to have to add some of these to my list as well.
Great.
Thank you for those recommendations. And I know you had hinted about travel throughout our conversation today. You've been to a lot of different places between Africa, the Arctic, all these exciting places for science. And I think field research gives you a great opportunity to do this, but also conferences. And it's really just a big part of the life of a scientist. So can you think back now, Chris, on all the places that science has taken you, and tell us about your favorite destination?
That's an easy one. There's a patch of the Dempster Highway north of the Arctic Circle, and it's about 4 or 5 kilometers south of where the Yukon border meets the Northwest Territories border. And there's a spot that you can stand in that location and look towards the Richardson Mountains across some of the most spectacular tundra you can imagine. And it's just the most breathtaking landscape in a very empty and amazing part of the world. And that, without a doubt, is the most beautiful part of the world I think I've ever been to. And so if I were to say where have I been through my scientific career that is my favorite, I could actually go and mark an X on the spot on the road where I like to stand because I have about 500 pictures from that location.
That's awesome.
And every time we're up there, I drive my students crazy. I'm like, I'll stop the car. We got to get out. I got to take some more pictures because the light's a little bit different or there's a cloud bank up there. And with the 24 hours daylight up there in the late spring and early summer, you get this low, gentle light, that soft light. And up in the Arctic, above the Arctic Circle, it just goes on for hours and hours and hours. So it's just stunning.
Well, it sounds breathtaking. So I must ask, is this patch of highway like on the way to a field site?
It is. It's an area of the tundra that we spend a lot of time studying. So we've done a lot of work right at that spot. That's actually what originally took us there. And one reason we do go back there with some frequency.
Wonderful. So working with students in the field, have you encountered any challenges? Or I know a lot of students don't necessarily have fieldwork experience before they start undergraduate. Is this something that you find there's some training or things that you have to do ahead of time to prepare people for the tundra since it is a more challenging environment to work in?
That's a great question. There is training required. I try to get my students to do wilderness first aid so that they're equipped for any crisis that might emerge. And you're off the radar there in terms of there's no cell phone reception, and we carry a way to connect if there's an emergency arises through a sat phone. But remote fieldwork comes with training. I think one of the biggest challenges, though, is actually preparing people and dealing with the mosquitoes that are up there. And northern fieldwork sounds very glamorous and interesting in many ways, but it's also super challenging because when your head's down in the tundra, on the right kind of day, there are just thousands of mosquitoes just after you all the time. So you have to develop really sort of a philosophy almost and a mindset in order to deal with the biting flies because they can be a real challenge. And then when you go to the campsite for the night, you're still not spared from them because when you enter your tent, you have to spend about 10 or 15 minutes killing all the mosquitoes. And you sure hope you don't have to pee in the middle of the night.
Right. Well, this sounds like a challenge. So how do you train somebody to get this mindset to deal then with these mosquitoes and flies?
I warn them a lot, and it's really just to try to prep ahead of time to recognize that, look, it sounds great, it sounds exciting, but when we interview potential undergraduates to work with the grad students, we are very careful to make sure people are aware that it's tough. It's beautiful, and it's the most spectacular part of the world, but it's tough. So there's not specific things I can do to train people for the mosquitoes, although I can take them to a local forest at the end of May or early June, and that'll give them a good taste of what it might be like. But
part of the interview there.
Yeah, part of the interview. Let's go stand around without bugs for fun for a little while. Let's see how we do.
Who's resilient enough? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Very cool. Wonderful to hear more about your work and some of these fantastic places you've been able to go. And you hinted before at the human side of science when you were talking about the obligation that we have to connect with the public and connect with people. And I think this human element in science is so important because science is ultimately done by people. And I think there are so many fantastic people and personalities in science. A lot of quirky traditions spring up in different laboratories, or you just share some phenomenal memories together. So Chris, do you have a story you want to talk to us about today that kind of shows the human side of science?
I think that's one of the big misconceptions about science is that science, because it's so objective and rational and rigid and we follow the scientific method, that we can't have fun or there isn't a human side to it, which is so far from the truth. Some of the most creative, fascinating, talented people in all sorts of ways are scientists. I know so many musicians who are scientists. I know so many people that science is just part of what they do and part of who they are. In terms of lab traditions, I mean, the one thing that we haven't done in recent years, but we had a great baker in our lab who would always bring cupcakes. And then we had spider cakes in the lab, baked spider cakes, which are spectacular.
Are there spiders in the cakes?
No, they're just made to look like spiders.
Okay.
Not actual spiders in the cake, although we certainly eat a lot of insects. We had a student that always brought baking with insects in them. So that's been kind of fun as well. So yeah, quirky celebratory cakes in the lab has definitely been a tradition. We don't socialize nearly enough as a lab, and that's partially my fault because I'm pretty busy. But yeah, we try to have fun, try to do things that's outside of the lab environment as well.
Well, spider cakes sound fantastic. Are you a baker yourself?
Not much of one. I can do banana bread pretty well.
Excellent.
It's hard to screw up banana bread.
This is true. I tend to, anything with 5 ingredients or less, that's my rule for
me too.
Anything cooking. Well, fantastic to hear more about your lab and some of the traditions that you've developed over the years. And I know we've talked about some of the research that you've been able to tackle in your career so far, but I think every scientist has these burning questions, these things that they are so curious about and would love to answer, but maybe there's something standing in their way. So Chris, if we took away all the barriers, funding, staff, technology, feasibility, not a problem. Is there one question burning in your mind that you are dying to know the answer to?
I think so. I think it has to do with ballooning spiders. Ballooning spiders, you have to imagine that little baby spiders, the way they get around long distances, they climb up to the top of a blade of grass or a fence post, and they stick their abdomens or their butt ends into the air and release a bit of silk. And then the wind comes along and picks them up and they sail away. And this has been known for such a long time. We know that spiders balloon around the world, and spiders are among the first things to arrive, say, after a volcano or in new landscapes. They're always arriving. They have this incredible ability to balloon around the world. But what I'd love to know is actually somehow track one cohort of spiders, one group of spiders that emerges from one egg sac, brothers and sisters, and see how far they go. How far do they really go? And do this over and over again to actually get an average distance at an individual level. Now, we can do this indirectly through, say, population genetics or looking at relatedness in sort of a larger spatial scale, but it's not the same as actually tracking individual spiders from where they took off to where they landed. That's what I'd like to tackle. And I have no idea how to do that. That's why the feasibility thing is always in the way of that question. But I think that would be so cool to actually know those paths that spiders travel when they're ballooning around the world. And they go way up into the atmosphere and way out onto the ocean. And Charles Darwin talked about spiders raining down on him when he was 1,000 miles off the coast. So they get around, but I'd love to know that.
You need really tiny radio collars. That is the solution.
Yeah, that's right. Tiny radio collars. Very tiny.
So now, is this a behavior that all spiders demonstrate, or are there certain types of spiders that show this ballooning behavior?
It's a bit mixed. The main clade of common spiders that we get in North America, let's say, most of them will balloon when they're juveniles. And some adult spiders that are small body will also balloon. Not all, but most will balloon as juveniles. Some with various abilities and some more frequently than others. But yeah, most of them do.
Well, I think you've just provided more fuel for all of our nightmares, me and our listeners.
That's right.
Now have another thing to be afraid of, floating spiders as we go outside.
That's right, absolutely.
Well, Chris, wonderful to hear about one of these big questions that's in your mind. And I know throughout our interview, we've chatted about some of the people who've had a big impact on you throughout your journey as a scientist. And I think these people are great sources of advice and inspiration. They get you through some of the tough times. Can you think back, and is there one piece of advice that really rises up in your mind as one that was just the best piece of advice you ever received from somebody that you can share with us?
Pretty soon after I started my tenure track job at McGill, I had a colleague who sat me down and said, you don't have to work all the time to be successful at this job. You can take weekends off, you can have a life, you can be involved with other things than just your work. In other words, you don't have to live and breathe every part of your job to be successful as a professor at a university. And he was right. And I took that to heart. And I've always tried to manage my time and manage my balance between work and life so that I'm mostly home for dinner and that I don't work on weekends. And you can do that. And that goes against a lot of the common thought out there around how much professors have to work to be successful. And I think there are different ways to measure success, and there's different ways to run your life and prioritize. But that was damn good advice.
Absolutely. Well, I think this is a really great point to bring up. I think this work-life balance is a concern for a lot of young scientists as they're looking towards their future, maybe have a workaholic boss at some point. And I know the life of a scientist, it can overrun your schedule if you let it. So are there certain tips or maybe little pieces of advice you can share in terms of what helps you maintain that balance?
It's just about priorities. Know when to say no and know when it's good to say yes, and stick to our guns a little bit. And you take vacation, really take vacation. And if it's a priority to be home to have dinner at a certain time, then you're not available for other things. At the same time, you have to be community minded and be open and do say yes to the right things and do get involved and engaged so that you're a part of your scientific community. What do I do in my sort of general habits to try to stay productive and do what I can within a reasonable amount of hours per week? I think it's managing email and communications in a certain way so that you're not just always spending time on email. Delegating. I tell my grad students that they need to be independent thinkers. I'll be there to help, but there's also ways that grad students can mentor each other and develop their own community. So helping your students be their own leaders in science so that the research can proceed without me having to be directly involved with research day in and day out is another way that I do it. And also not being a perfectionist. I'm not saying don't give up on the rigor or academic excellence of the work, but in some cases, we overthink how we might construct one paragraph or whether we need to do another whole set of analysis when in some cases it's never going to be perfect, and we need to know when it's good enough and when it's a solid piece of work, but you can actually get it out the door and not obsess about every tiny detail, knowing that the big picture is correct. Some of those things are ways that I've found so that it's not been too overwhelming and try to find that balance.
I think that's very helpful. And I really like the pieces you brought up about delegation and making sure your students are leaders within the lab. And I think giving students permission to make decisions is almost one of the most liberating things that I have come across. Is You don't have to ask me everything. Like, I don't care what color that is, those sorts of things. You can make these decisions yourself.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it's part of the training too, right? It's understanding how to do the permits and how to help with grant applications and how to run the logistics. That's all part of the training as a scientist. And so in a lab environment, that also needs to be part of the training in my mind.
Definitely. Well, fantastic advice you've shared with our listeners today. Is there any other last piece of advice or maybe one last note of inspiration, Chris, that you want to end our conversation on today?
I think the big one is be curious and follow your passions in science, because many things are skill-based and we can learn how to write a tweet, how to write an article, how to do an analysis in a stats program, how to identify things. Those are skills that can be learned. But this idea of passion and curiosity and creativity, a lot of that is very innate and needs to be celebrated together with the scientific side in a very intimate way. So that's, to me, the one piece of advice I would give is follow the passions. I mean, within science, there's just lots of room for passion, enthusiasm, and creativity, and we need to celebrate that. So that needs to be an integral part of who we are as a scientist.
I love it, Chris. Fantastic message to leave our listeners with today. Can you tell them now if they want to get in touch with you or if they want to learn more about you or your work, where should they go?
My blog is a great place to find more information, and that's arthropodecology.com. So one word, arthropodecology.com.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely check out his blog. Some great articles on there, and follow him on Twitter. And Chris, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a piece of your story.
It's been a real pleasure, and I love the philosophy of your podcast, and that let's discuss and understand that science is a very human endeavor, and I really appreciate that sentiment. Thank you for the time.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris. And listeners, thank you as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.